Welcome to Whiskey Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 759 for March 17th, 2019, St. Patrick's Day. Coming up in a few minutes,
we're looking at trends in the US whereby through the IWSR data, there is a very strong probability that Irish whiskey sales will surpass Scottish whiskey sales in the next 5 years.
That's David Stapleton of the Connacht Whiskey Company and the chairman of the Irish Whiskey Association. Before you brush off his projection as pure Blarney, keep in mind that Irish whiskies once ruled the world, outselling Scotch, American, and Canadian whiskies. I'll have more with David Stapleton later on Whiskey Cast in Depth. And I'll also talk with Tim Herlihy, who took some time off from his regular job as a brand ambassador for Tullamore D.E.W. recently. He, writer Conor Kelly, and the owners of New York City's The Dead Rabbit Pub, Sean Muldoon and Jack McGarry, piled into a van to travel throughout Ireland, collecting stories from distilleries, pubs, and, of course, a few of Jack's cocktail recipes. Their new book is From Barley to Blarney, a whiskey lover's guide to Ireland. Tim Herlihy will join us later on, too. I'll also have the calendar of events, your voice, and on Behind the Label, what does this week's U.S. college admissions scandal have to do with the whiskey business? The answer, and much more, just ahead on this week's Whiskey Cast.
Whiskey Cast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. Less than 2 weeks and counting now until Great Britain's scheduled March 29th exit from the European Union. And while British voters may not be familiar with the American phrase, 3 strikes and you're out, Prime Minister Theresa May is swinging for the fences with 2 strikes. As we're recording this, May is pushing for one final Parliament vote on her Brexit deal with the European Union ahead of a meeting with EU leaders on Thursday. The first 2 votes saw May's deal defeated by some of the widest margins in years, and Sunday, ministers said that vote would only take place if it appears May is likely to win. Chancellor Philip Hammond told the BBC this weekend that it's now, quote, physically impossible to leave on March 29th, but a third rejection could delay the final departure date even longer. The problem is, it may not be physically impossible at all, since every single one of the other 27 EU member nations would have to agree to extend that March 29th deadline. The key sticking point remains the Irish border and how to avoid the reimposition of a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, Irish whiskey sales worldwide grew by more than 13% last year, and the industry is in the middle of a boom not seen since the glory days of Irish whiskey back before World War I. The International Wine and Spirits Report tracks whiskey sales worldwide and is forecasting that Irish whiskey sales could outpace sales of Scotch whiskey in the U.S. over the next 5 years if current sales trends continue. Irish Whiskey Association Chairman David Stapleton touted that forecast the other night during a St. Patrick's Day event at Ireland's New York City consulate.
That absolutely is a game changer. Now, I look at it in a private capacity, through the Whiskey Association and also through Connacht. There's a real opportunity for me to be able to create some space just for myself in a brand creation capacity, because there's interest with the consumer. They're looking at Irish as a category that's growing. The challenge is that there's a displacement potentially for Scotch, but more and more people are coming into the brown spirits sector, and they're challenging themselves. They want more. They don't want the white spirits anymore.
The event was co-sponsored by the Distilled Spirits Council. The council released 2018 sales and import data last month. Sales of single malt and blended Scotch whisky combined totaled 9.5 million cases, valued at around $2.3 billion. Irish whiskey volume grew by 10% to 4.7 million cases, with a value of $1 billion. I'll discuss this and the Brexit issue in more detail with David Stapleton in just a few minutes. Back in November, we reported on the revival of the Red Spot single pot still Irish whiskey in episode 740. At the time, it was only available in Ireland, but has now reached more markets, and this past week, it arrived in the largest single export market for Irish whiskey, the U.S. Middleton master distiller Brian Nation spent most of this week in the U.S. promoting the launch, and we sat down for a quick chat.
I suppose good things come to those who wait, and it's great to have the anticipation, and it's here now, so we'll be looking forward to the launch, and I'm sure people will be absolutely amazed by the flavours that the whisky maturing for 15 years, some of it in Marsala wine cask, delivers to the overall whisky. It's a fantastic single pot still whisky.
Yeah, good things come to those who wait, but I've been the one that people keep bugging, going, when the hell are we going to get Red Spot?
I know, but, isn't it great that we're actually here now actually talking about it, and that people are going to get the opportunity to taste it, because it is a fantastic whisky.
And the story behind this, again, is this is the 15-year-old whiskey that the Mitchell family created back in the day and put some in Marsala wine casks, and your guys recreated it, essentially.
Absolutely, and it's a fantastic collaboration still with the Mitchell family, to be able to go back to the old recipes and to be able to show the authenticity, and to actually show the historical way that the Spot range was in years gone by, and to be able to take that information and to reimagine Red Spot today and to release this Red Spot 15-year-old. It's absolutely fantastic.
Let's talk about what else you've been working on. You guys broke down and did some gin, didn't you?
Yeah, we released a gin, a Method and Madness micro-distilled gin, just a couple of weeks ago. We're really excited about it. It's a very small batch. It's really made with 16 different botanicals. The main botanicals being black lemon and wild Irish gorse flower, and we're really, really happy with the way it turned out. It's, I suppose, another innovation that we've been able to do from the micro distillery, and working alongside Henry Donnelly has been really an exciting time for us, and it's gone down very well at the launch, and so far so good. People love the taste.
And this is a sign of what we can expect to see from Method and Madness in the future, more experiments like this, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, the idea behind the whole Method and Madness brand anyway was around experimentation and showcasing the innovation, the continued innovation that we have at the distillery, and also showing the craft credentials that we have at the distillery. And obviously with the addition of the micro distillery a few years ago, it's great to be able to do a lot more liquid development and liquid innovation. So we're really excited about that space at the moment.
While I've got you, how's the latest expansion coming? Because I know that the cranes are out again.
It's a very busy time at the distillery, and I suppose it showcases the success of the distillery and all of our brands. And, we're working our way through the next phase of the expansion at the moment. We have just had a few fermenters delivered to us recently, and it's a really busy but exciting time, and it's great for the distillery, and it's also great for Middleton and great for the Irish whiskey category.
And let's talk about that for a second. This category has just exploded. You're up to 23 distilleries in Ireland now, many more coming. How much bigger can this get?
I suppose if you look at it, we're still very, very small in the overall world whisky category. So I think there's great scope for the category to grow. It's a very exciting time, as you say, because, when you look at all of the new distilleries that are opening up now, and, the focus that they also have on single pot still Irish whisky, which, up to a few years ago, we were the real custodians of. We were the only people that were producing single pot still Irish whisky. And now to see that interest expanded across the other distilleries as well is absolutely fantastic. We're thrilled to see it.
The Method and Madness range is not available in the U.S., and there are no plans to change that in the near future. But you'll find my tasting notes for Red Spot at whiskycast.com. In other news, it's not been unusual for whiskey writers to also work within the industry. But that has primarily been the case in Scotland, where writers like Charles MacLean and Ian Buxton have worked with whiskey makers over the years. But it is far less commonplace in the U.S., and that's why the news this week that longtime whiskey writer Heather Green is making a big and bold move turned some heads. She's joining the Ben Milam Distillery in Blanco, Texas, not only as their head blender, but also as a partner and CEO. The key question is, why get out of the wonderful world with all the stability of whiskey writing to actually start making whiskeys of your own?
Are you being sarcastic about the stability of writing?
Who, me? Sarcastic? Nah.
Well, I don't lose the writing by doing this. I actually can still be a writer, and I can still write articles and get ideas going and generating. So I don't lose that. It's really just sort of an addition to what I've been doing. But more than an addition, it really feels as a nice new challenge, putting together what I've been doing for the past over a decade at this point for lots of companies and pulling it under one roof. And to me, that seemed like a really exciting challenge. So I'm ready to do it.
How did this all come about?
This came about because from a public-facing perspective, I'm a writer and an author. But in the background, I've worked quite a bit with companies and helping them create strategic marketing campaigns. I've helped them optimize their inventory to get their cost of goods to a better place. I've been nosing and tasting behind the scenes, batching, blending, all of that kind of stuff. I've worked in different facets of the industry, bartending, managing restaurants, being a waitress. I've done sales, ambassadorship, worked with distributors for years. And this seemed like when I was traveling and working on one of these projects, this was a brand that I'd met. And it seemed like I could pull all those things under one roof and really throw my weight behind one brand and my energies behind one brand to see how I could make it move.
But why this
brand? So it was
brand?
A consulting gig. Good question. Why this brand? So after all my traveling and stuff, one, I think being able to steer a ship the way I can do that with this team here is very exciting. I have been asked, to jump on board other brands and things, but what I did particularly love about this brand was the team. Marlene Holmes, who had been distilling for Jim Beam for 27 years, does it with such, pun intended, fluidity. She's such a natural at it. She's watching her work the still room. It's just, there's just such a poetry about it. She does it with such ease and doesn't even realize how that experience is so unusual in craft distilling. And working with somebody who worked with Booker No, to me, was just an opportunity I didn't want to miss. We have a brewer. His name is Jordan Osborne, and he's brewing and creating such a nice, fresh, clean. He's creating such a beautiful constituents that go into the still. And so for me, it just felt like I have this incredible whiskey making team that I can create. And then on top of that, we had Marsha Milam, who is an entrepreneur and a businesswoman down in Austin. And she had created the Austin Film Festival. She's a music producer. And for those who know me, know I'm also a musician, or spent many years on tour as a musician. And it just felt right. It felt like it was a very creative place to be. It felt like it was full of newness, innovation. Everybody's willing to innovate, take risks. And then, in case of Marlene and I, we're basically starting new lives in a new state. And it just felt exciting.
Their first release is coming this summer with the debut of Milam and Green whiskey. It'll be the first to use whiskey being distilled in Blanco, and it'll be blended with Tennessee whiskey and bourbon distilled under contract.
There's lots of ways to make whiskey now, and we produce bottles And we want to celebrate that. We want to open our doors and let people in and see how we select barrels to bottle, how to blend, how to create whiskeys for distribution, and really how it's done behind the scenes. And we're excited about that. So Mild and Green is going to be that brand. Our first bottling is in July. We're targeted for July if everything goes well, of course, with all the things we need to do before we get there. But it's going to be the first brand that is Marlene and Jordan's distillate. So it's going to be a batching of straight bourbon whiskey from Blanco, from the distillery in Blanco. And it's going to be a vintage Old Tennessee whiskey and then a base of about a 3-year-old bourbon from Tennessee as well. And then I'll proof that down. We're deciding on the proofs now, and we're going to bottle it and release it.
At the end of our interview, I jokingly told Heather to not screw this up, or should make it harder for other whiskey writers to make the jump into producing their own whiskeys. I did not say the rest of us. I know my limitations. Making whiskey is too much work for me, but wishing Heather the best of luck. New whiskeys to talk about this week. Heaven Hill has released the spring batch of Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond bourbon. This is the third of 10 planned releases in the series, and comes from bourbon distilled back in the fall of 2005. Coincidentally, right about the time that the first Whiskey Cast episode went live. It's bottled at 50% ABV, of course, and carries a recommended retail price of $130 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at whiskycast.com. Beam Suntory has released the first batch of Booker's Bourbon for 2019. It's nicknamed Teresa's Batch in honor of longtime distillery worker Teresa Whittemer. She was hired by Booker No to work at the Jim Beam Distillery more than 30 years ago and has helped select not only the barrels for this batch, but for almost every batch of Booker's over the years. It's available at a recommended price of $79.99 a bottle in the U.S. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Japan's Nikka whiskey was about to release the new tailored blended whiskey. Not only is that one coming out, but Nikka is also releasing Nikka Days. It's a blend using lightly peated single malt from the Miyagikyo distillery, along with single malt from Yoichi and coffee-stilled distilled malt and grain whiskeys. It's being sold in Europe with a recommended retail price of around €40 a bottle. That's around $45 at current exchange rates. No word yet on whether it'll be available in the U.S. or not. Springbank is out with its 2019 release of its 21-year-old single malt from Campbellton. It's a mix of malts matured in port and rum casks. Only 3,600 bottles will be available worldwide for around £195. That's around $260 each. And finally, while the Scotch Whisky Association won its recent court fight in Germany over a distillery's move to call its whiskey Glenbuchenbach, the association's legal team lost a battle in Singapore. Singapore's Intellectual Property Office rejected the SWA's attempt to block a Japanese retailer from registering a trademark with the word tartan in it. Isetan Mitsukoshi had wanted to register the name Isetan Tartan, but the association argued that the word tartan could function as a geographical indicator for whiskey, using a creative interpretation of Singapore's intellectual property law. According to the Drinks Business, that argument did not fly with the regulator hearing the issue. She ruled there was no evidence that tartan is used to identify whiskeys, and noted that the UK government does not protect tartan as a geographical indicator. SWA officials are debating whether to appeal that ruling. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. The Khaleesi may have her dragons, but only Highland Park has the Dragon Legend. It shows off the richer and smokier side of Highland Park. Like the dragons, you won't find the Dragon Legend everywhere, but the quest for it will reward you in the end. Find out more about the entire Highland Park range at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the Whiskey Cast calendar of events, and it's going to be a busy couple of weeks. I'll be in Cornwall, Ontario this coming weekend for the Wonderful World of Whiskey show at the NAV Center in Cornwall. I hope to see some of you there. Whiskies of the World San Jose is on the 21st in San Jose, California, followed by Whiskies of the World in San Francisco 2 nights later on the 23rd. The New Orleans Bourbon Festival is also this week from the 20th through the 23rd. The Midlands Whiskey Festival is this weekend in Stourbridge, England. Ardbegg's Escape Tour Bus is in the Phoenix area, and Catoctin Creek Distillery has its 10th anniversary party on the 23rd in Purcellville, Virginia. Benny's in Chicago has its annual Bourbon Women Night on the 27th, followed by its World of Whiskies Festival on the 28th. That's the night before Whiskey Fest Chicago on the 29th. Whiskey Live London is the 29th and 30th, and the Whiskey Festival Noord-Nederland is the 29th through the 31st in Groningen, the Netherlands. Finally, the American Whiskey Convention is coming up April 5th in Philadelphia. Right now, we have 210 different events on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival, tasting, or any other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to let us know about it, and we'll add it to the list.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Whiskey Cast In Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. We've seen the boom in Irish whiskey's growth worldwide over the last several years. And of course, we talk about it here on Whiskey Cast a lot more often than just around St. Patrick's Day. That would be like talking about bourbon only around Booker No's birthday. Maybe St. Booker? In any case, Irish whiskey's success in recent years has drawn a lot of attention after a century that nearly decimated the industry. David Stapleton of the Connacht Whiskey Company is the current chairman of the Irish Whiskey Association. We spent a few minutes the other night talking about the state of Irish whiskey in 2019.
I've heard it really described that Irish whiskey is at a crossroads right now, or at a tipping point. How would you describe it?
I would call it a renaissance. We've literally come from a scenario back in the 1980s where we had an industry that was on its knees. We had the coming together of Irish distillers as a last hurrah to save the industry. So I would say the 20th century was, a lost century. I see the 21st century as, we've come from 4 distilleries to 23 distilleries in the last 5 years. So we have real action and activity in a sector that is just buoyant. Now, it's buoyant on the back of the efforts of Pernod and Jameson, but a rising tide carries all boats. So it's been fantastic for us. So I see a true renaissance, even over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. So it's fantastic. And when we look at the trends, we're looking at trends in the US, whereby through the IWSR data, there is a very strong probability that Irish whiskey sales will surpass Scottish whiskey sales in the next 5 years.
That's going to shake up a lot of people in the industry.
That absolutely is a game changer. Now, I look at it in a private capacity, through the Whiskey Association and also through Connacht. There's a real opportunity for me to be able to create some space just for myself in a brand creation capacity, because there's interest with the consumer. They're looking at Irish as a category that's growing, The challenge is that there's a displacement potentially for Scotch, but more and more people are coming into the brown spirits sector, and they're challenging themselves. They want more. They don't want the white spirits anymore. So you have a lot of women drinkers. You have, it's just whiskey is opening up to so many more people, and that's creating great opportunity.
You mentioned 23 distilleries. We just got there this week with the opening of Clonakilty. How are you doing in terms of that 10-year plan that was released a few years ago?
Well, if you look at the run rate, so what we said is that we would double by 2020, and then we would double again by 2030. We're surpassing those targets at the moment. So the future is bright. We don't seem to have any... Okay, with the exception of Brexit, we don't know what's going to happen there. We have some other political situations that America's our biggest market, and if there were trade sanctions that were to cover Irish whiskey, then that would be a very real challenge. But under the current scenario, the trends are surpassing even our expectations.
So far, we've not seen any indication of trade sanctions yet that would involve Irish whiskey, but we do see Brexit, as you mentioned.
Yes, we do see Brexit. So we don't know, even in an all-Ireland capacity. So the Irish Whisky Association represents not just the companies in the south, but it also represents the likes of Bushmills. It represents Ekinville. So we have partner companies in the north. And there's a real challenge to try and understand what dynamic is going to come to pass and what the effect of it is going to be. Positive, negative, neutral, nobody knows. So until Theresa May starts to map out what her intent is, this is just a roll of a dice.
As we're recording this interview, there are around 3 weeks left before the crash date.
March 29th, yeah.
How worried are you?
I am nervous. It's very hard to quantify on a scale of 1 to 10. Am I a 9 or am I a 7? There's just so much uncertainty. Who knows? Absolutely, who knows? But it's that nagging thing in the back of your head that just won't go away. So until we get some sort of certainty out of Westminster, and the core issues for Westminster happen to relate to the backstop agreement, which is part of the withdrawal agreement. And that was something of Westminster's creation. So we're in a situation where the backstop is now the fundamental issue within Westminster, but it was also clauses that were written into the agreement, the withdrawal agreement, by Westminster. So we have huge conflict between what's going on in the north with the DUP and the dynamic that's going on at Westminster. You have Labour that are taking a very passive role. So it's just, the leadership and the uncertainty on the back of lack of leadership is a real worry.
And let's put the backstop into context for people who may not have been paying attention around the world. This is the question of whether a hard border goes back up to enforce the EU Customs Union and European law in the Republic of Ireland, as opposed to Northern Ireland, which will remain part of the UK after the crash out.
Absolutely. That's it in it. That's a very good summary, Mark. A very good summary.
How worried are you about that hard border?
Well, I grew up with a hard border on the island. So before we became, before the North became a dissolved and had their own government, I remember crossing through checkpoints. So I know what it was like. I know the disruption that it created. And if you look at the amount of movement between North and South, just in terms of our industry, whether it happens to be Irish whiskey or even Irish creams, you got cream dairy product coming out of the north that's been converted into Irish creams in the south. You have the movement for blending purposes of whiskey between the south and the north. So you put a hard border in there, there's going to be disruption. It's going to have to be checked. There is excise activities that you're going to have to measure the liquid, you're going to have to sample it, you're going to have to take a lorry, bring it into the side of the road. You just can't say, hey, the registration on that lorry is good, pass through. It does mean that you are going to have to stop and you are going to have to be vetted.
And it's also going to have an impact on tourism, which is equally as important for these distilleries.
Absolutely. And if you look at one of our core, we rolled out last year the Irish Whisky tourism strategy, which is an all-Ireland tourism strategy. So, you look at that hard border. So the movement of people, the movement of goods, the movement of everything, you're going to just, I don't want to say you're going to break the country in two, but you're going to it's going to be massive disruption. And I do worry about that.
Best case scenario. Everybody comes to their senses by March 28th?
That would be best case scenario. And even, okay, there's a lot of complexity in Ireland, as you know. Is it necessary to have a border between the north and the south? There's a natural border called the Irish Sea. So if there's some sort of harmonisation that could be created on it, you do have a natural border. Now, it does create issues for the north and the movement of people from the north into mainland UK. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? There's better minds than me, Mark, that have to figure that stuff out.
And that's what the DUP has been more concerned about.
Yes, they want to absolutely stay part of the union. Now, if that's the case, then the north stays part of the union and the hard border applies.
So let's end this on some good news. What's the best thing you can tell me about what's going on in Irish whiskey right now?
The best thing? Well, if you look at the room that we have here tonight, so we have 8 member companies from the Irish Whisky Association here. We're on the back of a year where sales of Irish whiskey is up 13.5% year on year. There's an energy in the room. You look at the attendee that are participating in the event today, and they are the who's of the media stateside. So if you look at just what that means and the effort that we're making and how Irish whiskey is being received, I think that's just outrageous. That's tremendous. That's absolutely tremendous.
One new release we did not mention during the news. David Stapleton's Connacht Whiskey Company released a new port cask finished version of its Ballyhoo grain whiskey this week. I'll have tasting notes for it soon at whiskycast.com. Now, the rapid growth in Irish whiskey means that most of the sources we've been relying on for details on Irish whiskey have now become very outdated. Tullamore D.E.W's Tim Herlihy spent some time in a van recently traveling around Ireland with writer Conor Kelly and the founders of New York City's The Dead Rabbit Pub, Jack McGarry and Sean Muldoon. The 4 of them have just released a new book on Ireland's whiskey culture, From Barley to Blarney, a whiskey lover's guide to Ireland. And I talked with Tim Herlihy during that St. Patrick's Day event at the Irish Consulate in New York City.
This is one of the more exhaustive compilations of Irish whiskey history, ephemera, recommendations, and everything I've seen in a while.
Yeah, and I'm glad for you to share the feeling of exhaustion, but we also have a massive feeling of pride with it, because as much as this is a travel guide, it's certainly a to-do list. So there's a bit of Irish whiskey history, production process, but there's 22 distillery profiles, and there's also 50 of the old school hidden gem Irish pubs. We just call them pubs in Ireland, but you get the point. And then we have 12 Irish whiskey cocktails crafted by Jack McGarry, and it really is the whiskey lover's guide to Ireland. Plenty to do, plenty to see, and hopefully a lot of maybe familiar distilleries, but certainly some new ones that we may have read about or heard whispers. It's an exciting time for Irish whiskey, and we tried to capture that excitement.
How hard was it keeping up with the distilleries over there? Because we're now at 23 operating distilleries as of this week. You got the newest one, Clonakilty, but which one are you missing that is operating now?
So a distillery in Galway, and we had to draw the line. There's a lot of different distillery projects out there, and our kind of thing was, if there's stills in the building, we'll highlight you. If it's not there yet, that's for another book. But it's all massive exciting times for Irish whiskey, and our 22 are definitely exciting and in different shapes and sizes, all adding to the conversation and doing something different.
One thing I noticed that was interesting is that you refer to the country of Ireland on the map, and I don't see any border on that map. You know something I don't know?
I'm not saying this is a prediction or a future spoiler, but when we talk about Irish whiskey, we talk about the island of Ireland. I could make all sorts of jokes about me growing up on the border, Jack and Sean growing up in Belfast, but when we talk about Irish whiskey, we talk about the island of Ireland, whether it's us or the Irish Whiskey Association. So we didn't want to leave anyone out.
But there's really no mention of the separation between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Does this book immediately become dated once Brexit hits and the border goes back up?
Well, it's going to be dated and a time capsule anyway. We'll see what the border, if or when it goes up, and what that looks like in terms of everyday life, but also in terms of Irish whiskey. Yeah.
Tell me about some of the pubs you frequented along the way, because I've had the chance to hit a few pubs around Ireland, and it's something I never try to miss when I'm over there. It really is sort of a unique part of the community, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is the centre of our community, particularly when you're in rural Ireland. Like, pubs in Ireland, they're one-stop shops a lot of the time. You'll come across these pubs that are spirits grocers where you can buy your groceries, and at the counter, I don't mean buy a whiskey or buy a Guinness, I mean you can drink it at the counter. Some of these places are undertakers as well, bakeries. Like, it is the centrepiece of the community, but also it's the gathering place of the community. And they're really, really special. And what we did is we tried to get, yes, ones that are close to distilleries, but ones that have character, story, history, and display that Irish pub hospitality. Because, and I'm biased, I'm a firm believer that the Irish pub is the world's favourite watering hole. It's not the German beer hall. The French have their cafes, the Italians have their restaurants. I think the English have made too many enemies over the years, and the Irish pub is the world's favourite.
Well, you do also mention, of course, the legendary Dick Mack's in Dingle, which was and still is a leather shop too, right?
Yeah. While you're waiting for your order to be taken, you can get a belt made, and they also have a brew pub now. So they have their own brewery there too, and one of the best, if not the very best, Irish whiskey selection in Ireland, Dick Mack's in Dingle, well worth visiting.
When do you start working on the second edition?
Well, seeing as the first edition is very close to being out of date, I think we'll take a bit of a breather, but what I like is this came for us at a very crucial moment in Irish whiskey, and it was something we really wanted to showcase, and we'll have to wait and see in the next one. But I think there will be a next one. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that crucial moment in Irish whiskey history. You're at a tipping point of really starting to get back to the good old days.
Yeah, and I was looking at an Irish Whiskey Association projection, and it's estimated in 5 years there's the potential for Irish whiskey to be bigger than Scotch in the US. That's the trajectory that we're on. We have a good bit of work to do that, but in terms of excitement, it's more about the liquids that we're seeing, the renaissance of old styles, the birth of new styles, whether that's single pot still Irish whiskey for a long time, which was exclusively in Middleton, but now we have liquids coming of age, whether it's at Teeling, Dingle, and all the other distilleries that are 3 years plus. We've different innovations happening with finishes, mash bills, and Tullamore we're starting to use wheat in our grain whiskey as well. And then the secret weapon of Irish whiskey is what we can do with our maturation in terms of going beyond oak and using different types of wood. So in terms of flavour combinations and permutations, whether you look at grains, mash bills, still type, finishing, wood type, it's all happening. All happening.
Tim Herlihy is one of the authors of From Barley to Blarney, a whiskey lover's guide to Ireland. You can order it through your local bookstore or online. That's WhiskeyCast in Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the new House Lannister Lagavulin 9-year-old. It's part of the Game of Thrones single malt Scotch whiskey collection from Diageo and HBO. You'll find it at a whiskey shop near you. And check out the rest of the Lagavulin single malts at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. And since it's St. Patrick's Day, let's start off with a couple of Irish whiskies. Walsh Whiskey Company's The Irishman Founders Reserve Caribbean Cask Finish is bottled at 46% ABV, and as you might guess, it's finished in rum casks. The nose has notes of molasses, brown sugar, citrus fruits, and oak tannins. The taste has mulled wine spices, along with a touch of molasses cookies, caramel, honey, and a touch of oak. The finish is long and sweet with a hint of spice, and I'm scoring the Irishman Founders Reserve Caribbean cask finish a 91. Last time around, I shared tasting notes for the Bushmills Distillery Exclusive, which took the classic Bushmills 10-year-old and finished it in acacia wood casks. But the Bushmills 10-year-old single malt deserves its own mention. It's bottled at 40% ABV. The nose has notes of cooked bananas, honey, and a slight maltiness. The taste is fruity and floral with red apples, nectarines, apricots, and a touch of oak tannins. The finish is long and fruity. I'm scoring the Bushmills 10-year-old Irish single malt a 90. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. The Bernheim name has a unique place in Kentucky whiskey's history, and we're proud to make our whiskeys at the Bernheim Distillery in Louisville. Bernheim Original Wheat Whiskey was the first new style of American whiskey introduced after the end of Prohibition, with a smooth, mellow taste that's unique, just like its name. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. The Barrel Craft Spirits Bourbon received a lot of praise when it came out recently. It's bottled at 52.5% ABV. The nose has notes of caramel, charred oak, molasses, pipe tobacco, and a hint of toasted vanilla. The taste is well-rounded and complex with great spices, balanced by caramel, molasses, and vanilla notes. The finish, long, aromatic, and smooth. I'm scoring the Barrel Craft Spirits Bourbon a 94. Finally, Belvois Noir is a unique French blended malt that uses malt whiskies from 3 different distilleries in France. And in the Noir edition, at least some of that malt is peated. It's bottled at 43% ABV. The nose has a hint of peat smoke, along with dried fruits, caramel, and touches of allspice and ginger. The taste is fruity with fresh berries, tree fruits, subtle spices, and just a touch of peat smoke to add complexity. The finish fades away gently with a good balance of fruit and spice notes. I'm scoring the Belvois Noir French Triple Malt an 89. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,500 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at whiskycast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. I had a feeling that we'd get a lot of comments after our interview last time around with Kat Augustin about the lack of respect many women get from men when it comes to whiskey. And I was right. At Real Sue Williams on Twitter jumped in as soon as she heard about the interview. That will be a great interview. I loved her story this week. I'm not in the biz, but as a female whiskey lover, I often deal with men ignoring me to talk to my husband, who promptly replies, "Ask her. She has the knowledge. I just drink what she tells me." That always startles them. Sherry Wong tweeted this from West Virginia. For someone seriously considering going to whiskey school, this is great encouragement. Lenny Eckstein from Deerhammer Distilling in Colorado tweeted this. Great interview with Kat Augustin. I get a close-up view of this from the sidelines as I watch the owner of Deerhammer Distillery my wife and boss, navigate the male-dominated whiskey landscape. We are better than this. #stop dramsplaining. That led to this response from Kat Augustin. Ooh, new term, dramsplaining. I love it. Just last night, a bartender explained to me that the next big trend is American single malts, and that means comes from one distillery. And I was like, yep. And here's yet another example of dramsplaining from @WhiskeryTurnip in Hawaii. I once overheard a shopkeep tell my wife that since she said she loves Isla's, she would love bourbon because it's just the American version and pretty much the same thing. I watched over a shelf as she looked at him as if he were a madman and said, "Sure, okay." Michael Dodd in Louisiana added this comment on our Facebook page. It's very unfortunate if some men feel that way. They are certainly missing out. I prefer to be part of a mixed group when tasting. I appreciate the differences and often learn more about a whiskey from ladies with more sensitive noses. I've had the great pleasure of meeting, dining with, attending seminars, and learning from wonderful, experienced, and knowledgeable women. The experience would certainly not be the same without them. I'm going to let our oldest daughter, Brianna Gillespie, get the last word in on this. Here's what she tweeted. I've literally had a guy at an event come up to me and tell me, "You don't have to drink whiskey if you don't want to." My coworker and I both nearly did a spit take, but that would have wasted good whiskey. Is it sexist to say that I'm a proud father? If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search for WhiskeyCast, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskeycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other stuff that all make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Wretched excess raised its ugly head this week when U.S. federal prosecutors unveiled a series of indictments in a massive scheme to fix the admissions process at a series of top U.S. colleges. So far, at least 50 people are facing federal charges that they conspired to either rig admissions tests or bribe college sports coaches to get kids from wealthy families accepted at their universities, even when those kids had never even played the sports they were being recruited for. Now, what does this have to do with whiskey? Well, at least one of the parents indicted in the case is involved in the whiskey industry. Marcy Palatella is the CEO of California-based International Beverage, which is also known as Allied Lomar, and has been involved in the distribution business along with her husband for many years. Let's make something really clear here. First of all, everyone's innocent until proven guilty in court. And 2, Palatella's company does not have any ties to Scotland's International Beverage Holdings, which is also known as Interbev and is the international unit of Thai Bev. It owns Balblair, Old Pulteney, Enoch, Inverhouse, Hankey Bannister, and other spirits brands. Now, Palatella has been charged with conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud after paying more than $500,000 to get her son into the University of Southern California. According to prosecutors, she bribed both test administrators and a USC athletic administrator through a college counseling firm. The founder of that firm has already pleaded guilty in federal court. In addition to owning a number of whiskey and other spirits brands, Palatella also owns the relatively new Preservation Distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky, which opened last year. And that raises this question. Could the charges against Palatella affect the federal and state permits required for her to operate those businesses? Since the federal government does do background checks on license applicants and holders, and many states have so-called good character language in their regulations for holding liquor licenses. The answer, in theory, is yes, it could. It all depends, though, on how the charges against Palatella are resolved in court. First off, according to TTB spokesman Thomas Hogue, who emphasized in an email that he was speaking in general terms and not commenting specifically on the college admissions case, criminal charges that are not related to the conditions for holding a basic alcohol permit would not be a basis for action. Now, the basic alcohol permit is the standard federal permit that anyone who wants to own a liquor-related business has to have. It's a prerequisite for a distilled spirits permit, the so-called DSP that you have to operate a distillery. So, in other words, unless the charges are for violating federal alcohol laws, the Treasury Department would not take any action. However, liquor businesses also fall under state regulation and licensing as well. Kentucky law specifically gives the state the power to revoke licenses upon conviction of any felony crime, federal or state, but that would likely not happen until the end of any appeals. And California, where Palatella's International Beverage is based, also takes action against license holders convicted of so-called moral turpitude crimes. Bradley Beach of the California Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control told us in a series of emails that even though bribery is not listed as a moral turpitude crime, the department would file an accusation on a felony conviction for bribery by a licensee, and that could result in suspension or revocation of their alcohol license. Remember, the federal charges against Marcy Palatella are conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. Now, if she and her lawyers were to reach a deal with federal prosecutors to plead guilty to reduced non-felony charges, that might fall below the level needed to trigger the sanctions at the state level. That's a big might, though. As of now, Preservation Distillery in Bardstown is still open, and its website is up, though the distillery's social media accounts have been taken down. We'll keep you posted as this case moves forward. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news, events, cocktail recipes, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes going back to 2005. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.